The Republican-controlled Georgia Senate voted on Monday to pass legislation that would restrict voting rights. Now, the state's legislative chamber voted about 29-20 to pass SB 241, which will now go to the Georgia House. It's expected to pass, and it's expected to go through the governor's desk. So now, of course, he's saying publicly, I don't really know what way I'm going to go on this yet. I'm going to have to read through it. But again, this is the Georgia former Secretary of State that did voter suppression in order to become governor. So I'm not holding out too much hope. All right. So now what's in this? What's in this piece of legislation? Well, it would end no excuse absentee balloting. So you would have to have a written excuse. And also it would, I'm sorry, let me explain that a little bit more. Voters who are eligible to vote by mail under the bill would also be required to submit a voter ID and have their ballot signed by a witness in order to have their vote count. The bill would also require a court order to extend polling hours, limit the use of any mobile voting sites, give the state's legislature power to temporarily block any emergency voting rule changes, and create a voter fraud hotline. Yes. Something that we absolutely, totally need, a voter fraud hotline. Maybe one person could call. Let me guess. It's probably just going to end up being flooded with people who are like, there's a black person voting. I think that's suspicious. You realize black people can vote, right? Out of the system. That's what's going to happen. But look, it's not the only bill that has targeted voting. In fact, last week, Georgia's House of Representatives also approved its own election overhaul bill that would, of course, include the same voter ID requirement as the state Senate bill, and also limit weekend voting. Limit weekend voting. Okay, how is that not an attack on working class people? Okay, who, guess what, can't take a day off to go and vote on a Tuesday. Is there any justification for limiting weekend voting or holding elections on a Tuesday right in the middle of the week? Again, this is not a voter holiday. It would be fine if Tuesday was a voting holiday, that you get the day off, you can go and vote, you can do whatever you need to do, and not have to work that day. Great. But Tuesday, just holding it on a Tuesday, again, you got to go to work, you got to go to school. If you're holding on 2 jobs, you got things to do. Unless you're a retired boomer with money and transportation, and maybe you're living in a white wealthy area, which tends to vote more Republican, you're going to be fine. But if not, if you're poor, if you're a student, if you're, if you're black in the city, you might not be able to find a polling place that's open, or might not have the time to be able to go out and vote because you're too busy working your ass off. And so, look, and here's the thing about white Republican voting areas. I happen to live in one of those, okay? They've got plenty of polling stations. I've never had a problem. I've lived in a fairly white Republican area. Never a line to vote. It's always very, very in. You're in, you're out. Great. Polling stations everywhere. No giant lines. I mean, it's fine. But there are areas where just so happens that a lot of black people live where there are gigantic lines, 6 to 7 hours long. I mean, and it's a result of all those polling places suddenly disappearing or being shut down. And I don't know, it almost seems like Republicans don't want certain people to vote. And when they do, of course, they try to punish them for exercising their voting. In fact, the Georgia House Bill 531 would actually make it a crime to give out free food or water to voters standing in line for hours. Well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to ban that from happening? I mean, we all know who ends up standing in line for hours. And again, it's because Republicans close polling places in heavily black populated areas because they don't want black people to vote. And so that's it. It's sick. It's disgusting. It's racist. It's an attack on your civic and constitutional right to vote. I believe you have a right to vote, and you should have that right respected. But the impact, of course, would be disastrous, and if it was passed, And the reason that they're going after it is pretty obvious. You had a massive amount of votes that happened in Georgia. About 1.3 million Georgians voted by mail in 2020. Why? Because you made it easier to vote. And look, even Republicans voted by mail, about 450,000 Republicans. And so you actually had a massive voter turnout in Georgia. And normally there's not a lot of voter turnout in 2016. Not a lot of voter turnout, at least not much compared to this. This was this voter turnout actually broke records. And so there was a lot of people. And part of that is because they made voting a little bit easier. They made it so that you were able to actually vote by mail, which is great. In fact, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, there was a gigantic increase in Black residents who voted by mail. However, as a result of, I don't know, a certain presidential candidate or president, presidential incumbent who was talking about how voting by mail is horrible and leads to massive fraud, you actually had a decrease in the number of white mail-in voters. In fact, it fell from 67% in 2016 to 54% in 2020. Very, very strange how that worked out. Very strange, very strange. So now, Stacey Abrams, she was one person that got cheated as a result of voter suppression in her state. She actually talked to Mother Jones about this on Monday and talked about the high turnout and the reasons for these laws that are being pushed in Georgia. Quote, in the last two election cycles, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of voters of color who voted by mail because it, again, is easier to do. The number of young people who used early voting, the number of African Americans who voted on Saturday and Sunday, we saw unprecedented levels of turnout across the board. And so every single metric of voter access that has been good in Georgia is now under attack. And it's true. It's true because, again, as I keep trying to hammer into your heads, Republicans don't want people to vote. They have never wanted people to vote. They have never especially wanted Black people to vote. That was the whole reason, again, for the Ku Klux Klan, is to get Black people to not vote. Now, of course, that happened to serve the Democrats back then before we had a party switch, whereas, you had generally the liberals were the Republicans and, the conservatives were the Democrats. 1960s, civil rights, there was a party switch. Republicans never tell you about that, how there was a party switch, and the racist Democrats ended up joining the Republican Party, and it flipped. And so Democrats actually became the party of civil rights and increasing voting. I know, it's crazy. So now, as a result, Republicans doubled down on the Southern strategy and appealed to a very, very small minority of racist white voters. And I'm not saying just, racist white voters in the South. Even though it is called the Southern strategy, there are white racists everywhere. And it's the same. It's the same thought process. We don't want those people to vote. And again, because when Black people exercise their rights, their power to vote, Republicans lose. Republicans lose. And so that's the result of this. Okay. And again, if voting were easy, as it is with, for example, mail-in voting, well, then you end up seeing more people that end up turning out. And as a result of that, Republicans are fucking toast. They'll never win another election. And that's why, by the way, this is why H.R. 1 that's going through the House of Representatives is so incredibly important, because it actually expands voting. And that has, of course, a prominent Republican, former President Donald Trump, and his allies. They're incredibly nervous about this. In fact, he's been calling around, asking people, and saying, does this have a chance of passing? Because if it does, quote, we might never win another election again. Weird how when Black people actually exercise their rights and exercise their power to vote, you end up having Republicans that get very, very nervous. Very strange. And I also love how they come out and just admit it. More people voting equals Republicans losing. And I'll tell you why. It's because their platform is deeply unpopular. They could actually win elections if they actually went from, being the party of racist oligarchs and reactionaries to a functional party that attempts to govern. And see, that's the thing. That's what Republicans don't do. They could actually say, hey, you know what? We were wrong about certain things. We were wrong about the Southern strategy. We're wrong about, certain things economically. And we actually are interested in governing. They actually might get some votes. But they've doubled down on racism. They've doubled down on giving everything to the rich. They've doubled down on oligarchy. And so, of course, they're not going to be a popular party. And so to combat that, they have to restrict the voting. They have to shut it down. They have to claim that, oh, no, our elections aren't secure. We're overrun with undocumented immigrants. We're undocumented. We got the illegals everywhere. Yeah, that's it. That's what's going on. No, there's no evidence to back any of the stuff that they're saying on undocumented immigrants voting. There's no evidence of voter fraud. No evidence of widespread voter fraud or widespread election fraud in any of these past elections. No evidence of widespread fraud when it comes to mail-in voting. They have nothing. They have nothing. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because to their cultists, they believe it. They believe it. And to the people that continue to spread these lies, well, they hold on to a small demographic that continues to vote for them on and on, over and over again, very reliably. And so, of course, they're going to hold on to this. And of course, they're going to do this. And so now, let me go to one more thing here. This is a quote here from Georgia Senate Majority Leader Mike Dugan. This is the person who sponsored the bill. And he said that he introduced the legislation. And in doing so, he said that limiting absentee voting was necessary to increase certainty that all the ballots were counted. Does that make any sense to you? Like, oh yeah, we got to limit how many votes so that we can count them all. Why don't you hire more people to count the votes? Doesn't make any sense, does it? What a weak sauce, like disastrous excuse for what is essentially an assault on voting rights. And that's what it is. If this passes, this would be the biggest reactionary assault on voting rights that we've seen since the elimination of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. And by the way, it would also be proof that we need Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Of course, sadly, the Supreme Court is now conservative for a generation at least. So we're not going to be able to reverse that ruling, unfortunately. But I guess we need to fight in other ways to ensure that everybody's vote is counted and that everybody who can cast a vote legally is able to do so. And that everybody who, wants to participate in the democratic process, in the small d democratic process, is able to do so and is able to exercise this fundamental right without people trying to shut them down. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.